It was the 4th of July weekend in 2013 when the Carter family packed their silver Toyota Highlander and pulled out of their gravel driveway in the quiet town of Ponderay, Idaho. Jeremy Carter, 38, had just finished his shift at the auto repair shop where he'd worked for nearly a decade. His wife, Dana, 36, had spent the day before baking cookies and folding clothes into a single red duffel bag. Their kids, Maddie, age 9, and Caleb, age 6, were buzzing with excitement. They were headed west, just a few hours' drive along Route 47 to visit Donna's sister in Colville, Washington. It was a trip they'd made many times before, uneventful and familiar, stretching just under 170 miles of winding forest highway, 2 gas stops, and 1 scenic pull-off they always promised to revisit next time. They left mid-afternoon on Friday. Dana texted her sister around 2:15 p.m. that they were finally on the road. Jeremy grabbed coffees from the local diner on the way out of town. A neighbor saw them at the intersection by the fire station. That was the last time anyone in Ponderay would see the Carter family again. When they failed to arrive by nightfall, Dana's sister assumed traffic, or that the kids had convinced them to stop somewhere along the way. But by midnight, the phone still hadn't rung. Texts went unanswered, calls went straight to voicemail. By morning, concern turned into panic. Dana's sister contacted Washington State Patrol and then the sheriff's office back in Idaho. Within 24 hours, a missing persons alert was issued. The Carters had simply vanished. Police began with the obvious. They retraced the known route between Ponderay and Colville, noting every highway, back road, and scenic detour. Friends confirmed the family had no camping plans, no spontaneous getaways, no reason to change course. Jeremy wasn't the impulsive type. Donna was meticulous. Their vehicle hadn't been seen at any of the usual stops. No toll cameras, no park entry logs, no hotel receipts. But then investigators uncovered a single sighting. Surveillance footage from a gas station off Route 47 captured the Carter SUV at 4:43 p.m. that same day. Jeremy stepped out, fueled the car, and exchanged a few words with a trucker at the next pump. Maddie could be seen in the back seat scribbling in a notebook. Dana purchased a pack of juice boxes and trail mix inside. There was nothing unusual, no one following them, no one lurking nearby. The timestamp matched the drive time from Ponderay and placed them about 2 hours from their intended destination. From that point forward, they disappeared without leaving a single trace. Search crews expanded their radius. Helicopters scanned cliffs, rivers, and dense forest. Dive teams explored ravines. Highway patrol checked every roadside ditch between the gas station and Colville. But no tire marks, broken rails, or signs of a crash were found. The SUV hadn't been impounded, no bank activity, no cell phone pings. The forest was dense, but the roads were maintained. It was hard to imagine a family of 4 just slipping away. No noise, no wreckage, not even a misplaced shoe. Investigators wondered whether they'd made a wrong turn or taken a side road that ended in trouble. But even so, the lack of evidence was staggering. Every day, people ran off the road, and sooner or later, something was found. But with the Carters, there was nothing. Over the next week, media attention grew. National outlets picked up the story. Missing posters were plastered across rest stops and ranger stations. Dozens of tips poured in, some from psychics, some from hopeful hikers. A woman reported seeing a similar SUV in a pull-off near the Yak River, but the lead went nowhere. Jeremy's workplace confirmed he had no enemies, no money trouble. Dana's search history revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just school supply lists and cookie recipes. There was no history of abuse, no sign of family strain. Their house was untouched, bills unpaid, toothbrushes still damp in the bathroom. It was as if they'd left expecting to return in time for dinner. Theories began to take shape. Some believed they'd driven off an unguarded cliffside, their SUV swallowed by the thick timberland or swept into a hidden creek. Others pointed fingers at Jeremy, speculating about a secret life or a planned disappearance. But nothing supported those ideas. He wasn't in debt. He wasn't running. Investigators began to admit what they rarely said aloud. They were stuck. There was no trail to follow. No one had seen them since the gas station. And for all their effort, the case had no witnesses, no suspects, and no reason. Months passed. The search scaled back. Billboards eventually came down. Dana's sister never changed her number. She kept the porch light on for almost a year. On the anniversary of their disappearance, she returned to that rest stop parked facing the road and watched every car pass for nearly 5 hours, hoping one might look familiar. She said she could still feel Maddie there, somewhere on that road, still drawing in the back seat, still waiting for someone to notice, and yet no one did. The highway that had always felt so familiar had swallowed a family whole, and 10 years would pass before anyone learned what it left behind. The moment the Carter family was officially declared missing, law enforcement moved fast. In the early hours of July 6th, less than 36 hours since they were last heard from, a multi-county search was initiated along the stretch of Route 47 between Bonner County, Idaho, and Stevens County, Washington. The terrain was unforgiving: dense forest, steep drop-offs, and side trails that twisted into old logging routes. For most families who vanished on road trips, evidence surfaced quickly: a skid mark, a submerged guardrail, something. But as the hours passed, nothing surfaced. There were no crash sites, no debris fields, no broken branches. Search helicopters traced the route during daylight, scanning for glimmers of metal or fractured trees. Nothing. Dive teams began combing riverbends and culverts, focusing on areas where the road hugged the waterline. Each time they suited up, the families waited in silence. Each time, they returned empty-handed. By the third day, the mystery deepened. Authorities reviewed traffic cam footage from both counties. Only one clear image placed the Carters in motion after leaving home: the gas station footage at 4:43 p.m., where Jeremy filled up and Donna bought snacks. After that, the Carter SUV vanished from every known surveillance point. Dozens of security tapes from nearby businesses, rest stops, and toll booths were reviewed frame by frame. There was no sign of them. One traffic camera located near the highway's state border had been malfunctioning since June. Investigators wondered if that blind spot held the answer, but there was no way to recover it. The digital trail ended at a single gas station. Beyond that, the road offered no clues. Still, authorities were cautious not to jump to conclusions. Cars don't just vanish, not in daylight, not with 4 people inside. Investigators began interviewing nearby residents, campers, hikers, and rangers who worked the surrounding forests. Flyers went up in small towns along the highway. A group of volunteers canvassed door to door, asking about sightings. Local fishermen were asked if they saw an SUV along unmarked paths leading to the water. Forest workers were questioned. No one had seen the family. No one heard a crash. No one remembered anything unusual that day. Some even drove the route themselves to understand how easy it would be to go off-road unnoticed. The conclusion was sobering. It was possible. Reporters picked up the story fast. A family of 4, gone without a trace on a routine trip. Their photos, Dana's warm smile, Jeremy's firm stare, Maddie's gap-toothed grin, Caleb's sleepy eyes, were splashed across newspapers and morning television. Journalists dubbed it the vanishing on Route 47. It didn't take long for theories to surface. Some said they must have encountered foul play, stopped by someone impersonating law enforcement, lured into the woods, abducted. Others pointed to the nearby river's unpredictable currents. Rumors spread online that a serial killer had been operating along the corridor, though police found no evidence of that. A few more outlandish voices suggested they'd staged their own disappearance, though that theory collapsed under scrutiny. The Carters weren't running from anything. Their bank accounts were untouched. Their phones went dark shortly after 5 p.m. on the day they vanished. Their passports, medications, and all important documents remained at home. They'd planned a 2-day trip. That was it. By the end of the first week, over 70 personnel had been involved in the search effort. Aerial scans used heat mapping, and sonar was brought in to explore deeper pockets of water. Rescue dogs were deployed, sniffing along roadside turnouts and trails. The dogs led searchers to a few abandoned campsites, but nothing connected to the Carters. A pair of shoes found in a ditch turned out to be size 12s, too large for Jeremy. A broken taillight fragment raised hope until it was matched to a 2007 Chevy, not a Toyota. Every potential lead evaporated within hours. Dana's sister kept a notebook of every tip that came in. She logged names, dates, and phone numbers. Some leads came from concerned citizens who thought they saw the SUV near Spokane. or passing a fruit stand in Sandpoint. But surveillance and witness accounts always contradicted them. The car seen in Spokane had out-of-state plates. The fruit stand attendant said she'd seen the kids before, but under closer questioning, it turned out she was confusing them with another family who often traveled that road. It became a pattern. Every report felt like hope. Every clarification reopened the void. 10 days in, law enforcement had no answers to offer. A press conference was held in front of the sheriff's office. Cameras flashed as officials repeated the same phrase. "We're pursuing all possible leads." But there were none left. It wasn't just that the trail had gone cold, it had never been warm to begin with. For Dana's family, the silence became unbearable. Jeremy's parents, who lived 4 hours south, hired a private investigator. Maddie's best friend at school kept writing her letters she would never send. Caleb's favorite stuffed bear sat untouched on his bedroom shelf, right where he left it. And still, the highway remained open. Traffic flowed past the very spots where investigators once stood. Drivers rolled over stretches of road where 4 lives had disappeared without so much as a fragment left behind. In a world full of signs and signals, there was none. And as days turned into weeks, one unshakable truth settled over everyone. Something had taken the Carters, but no one could say what. By the 3rd week of silence, theories surrounding the Carters' disappearance multiplied faster than law enforcement could track. With no evidence to confirm or deny any single explanation, the vacuum left behind filled with speculation. Online forums lit up with amateur sleuths dissecting timelines, surveillance stills, and regional crime patterns. Some pointed to the thick wilderness along Route 47 and insisted the family had veered off the road and perished in a remote ravine. Others rejected the idea that 4 people, 2 of them children, could vanish in a simple accident with zero trace. The idea of an abduction gained traction, especially among locals who believed someone with knowledge of the area may have intercepted them. Truck stops, rest areas, and long stretches of road without cell coverage became points of obsession. A few theorists even suggested the Carter SUV had been towed away by someone to hide the crime. The deeper the mystery became, the wilder the theories grew. One of the most persistent narratives revolved around Jeremy himself. As word spread that he was a former army mechanic, speculation turned toward darker motives. Commenters on Reddit and Facebook wondered if he had post-traumatic stress, secret debts, or a hidden reason to flee. A grainy photo surfaced of Jeremy in uniform, posted by a man claiming to have served with him during a tour in Afghanistan. That post alone spiraled into an entire subthread questioning whether Jeremy had snapped, orchestrated the family's disappearance, or driven them into seclusion. It didn't matter that his military record was clean or that coworkers described him as calm and even-tempered. Once the internet latched onto an idea, it rarely let go. Then came whispers of domestic tension. Someone unearthed an old court filing, a dismissed request for a temporary protective order Donna had filed 8 years earlier, shortly after Caleb was born. It had never gone to hearing, and no charges were filed. Still, that one document was enough to ignite doubts. Articles referenced it vaguely, suggesting possible past conflict. Reporters tried to reach extended family members for comment. Most declined, but when a local journalist finally spoke with Dana's sister, Melissa, her response didn't calm anything. She said, "Dana and I were close, but she stopped telling me things a few years ago. I think she was scared of something." That quote ran on every news station that week. Not long after, Jeremy's younger brother, Nate, who had been helping organize search efforts, responded publicly. Standing on the shoulder of Route 47 beside a missing persons poster, he called the rumors vile garbage and accused Melissa of using the tragedy for attention. He insisted Jeremy would never hurt his family and hinted that if people were really looking for suspects, they might want to check other places. That vague insinuation turned the already strained relationship between the two families into something worse. Quiet tension became open hostility. At vigils, they stood apart. On social media, they contradicted each other. It didn't matter that both sides were grieving. It began to look like they were on trial. Meanwhile, investigators struggled with their own uncertainties. Without a crime scene, a body, or a recovered vehicle, the Carters were simply gone. Foul play couldn't be confirmed, but neither could it be ruled out. Investigators pored over known offenders in the region. They cross-referenced parolees, sex offender registries, and anyone with a history of violence along the highway corridor. No one stood out. Every suspicious individual they tracked down had an alibi or no connection at all. They also examined traffic patterns and GPS data from delivery companies, rideshare apps, and logging vehicles. Not a single ping overlapped with the Carters' disappearance window in a meaningful way. The case, once high priority, slowly slipped into a lower tier of attention, not forgotten, but no longer active. Theories also fractured among law enforcement itself. Some believed the most logical answer was still an accident. The forest was vast, the cliffs unforgiving, and the SUV could have tumbled into an area too remote or too overgrown for detection. Others argued that the complete lack of physical evidence, no skid marks, no glass, no oil trail, suggested something more deliberate. One veteran investigator said privately that it felt clean, too clean. But without fresh leads or new forensic data, it remained a matter of opinion. Every door they opened led to an empty room. As months turned into a year, the case took on a mythic quality in the region. The Carter family became folklore. Truckers swapped stories of the ghost SUV on Route 47. Locals talked about the exit near mile marker 63, where people claimed they'd seen flickers of headlights deep in the woods, only to vanish seconds later. Urban legends grew where facts had failed, but for those who knew the Carters, there was nothing mysterious about what they felt. There was only grief, sharpened by the ache of not knowing. Dana's sister refused to stop posting weekly updates. Jeremy's parents stopped speaking to reporters altogether. Nate withdrew from the volunteer group. Suspicion turned inward. Accusations once whispered became direct. And still, there were no answers. Just a hole where a family used to be, and the growing dread that maybe the truth wouldn't be found in the trees, but somewhere closer, somewhere they weren't willing to look. It was nearly 14 months after the Carters disappeared when a long-haul trucker called the Stevens County Sheriff's Office with a tip that jolted the case back to life. The man, Raymond Hatch, was passing through the eastern edge of the Idaho-Washington border when he noticed a silver SUV pulled off near a gated dirt road commonly used by timber crews. What made him remember it, he said, wasn't just the make or color. It was the way the vehicle was parked, almost deliberately hidden behind a cluster of trees. At the time, he assumed it was a hunter or someone taking a break, but when he passed the same stretch 2 days later and saw the Carter family's flyer posted at a fuel stop, the memory hit him like a gut punch. He couldn't recall the license plate, but he was sure it matched the SUV in the poster. Within hours, deputies launched a full-scale operation to canvass the area surrounding the service road. They brought in ground crews, drones, and heat detection gear, searching for any sign of tire impressions, disturbed soil, or fragments of the vehicle. The terrain was rough, steep inclines, rocky paths, and dense underbrush that hadn't been cleared in years. Volunteers in orange vests scoured ravines, creeks, and old firebreak trails, hoping to catch even a glint of something metallic. For 3 days straight, searchers combed through square mile after square mile of unforgiving forest, and just like before, there was nothing. The SUV wasn't there. No trace of it had ever been there. Raymond stood by his account, but memory, it seemed, was not enough. Without physical evidence, the tip was filed away like all the others. False hope in a sea of dead ends. Over time, the case began to erode under the weight of silence. Dinah's sister Melissa, once the family's loudest voice in the press, stopped giving interviews. Jeremy's brother Nate withdrew completely. At one point, he was seen taking down the remaining missing signs himself, ripping them off telephone poles along Route 47. Investigators quietly scaled back their efforts, reassigning officers to higher priority cases. The file remained open, but active pursuit dwindled to the occasional database ping or automatic forensic cross-check. The Carters were no longer front-page news. They were a ghost story in small-town memory. Their home in Ponderay stayed untouched for almost 2 years. Dana's cousin maintained the property, mowing the lawn and bringing in the mail, but eventually it was listed for sale. A couple from Boise bought it, unaware of the history until a neighbor mentioned it casually during move-in. For a while, the house sat empty again, The porch light still burned out, the flower bed overrun. It became a local landmark not because of who lived there, but because of who never returned. Memorials were held every summer near the day they vanished. The first was a candlelight vigil at the park where Maddie and Caleb used to play. The second included a moment of silence on the school's morning announcements. By the fifth year, only a few family members and close friends showed up. Grief, when stretched too long, starts to calcify, hollowing out the space where certainty used to live. No one said it aloud, but most began to assume the Carters were gone, not missing, not waiting, just gone. But not everyone moved on. Detective Karen Fields was one of the few who stayed with the case from the very beginning. A career investigator with over 20 years in rural law enforcement, she refused to let it gather dust. Even after it was handed off to cold case analysts, she kept a personal copy of the file in her home office. Every few months, she'd return to the gas station surveillance footage. She knew it frame by frame, the way Jeremy rubbed his neck while fueling up, the slight turn Dana made as she looked back toward the store, the flash of a child's hand on the back window. She watched it the way some people read scripture, not for what it was, but for what it might still contain. She re-interviewed retired rangers, pulled maps no longer in circulation, even tracked down a former cartographer who had worked on logging access routes in the 90s. Karen believed the answer wasn't in foul play or some elaborate cover-up. She believed it was geography, that somewhere out there, hidden between two forks of a forgotten trail or shielded by the density of pine and shadow, was a vehicle and a truth waiting to be found. She wasn't the only one. A small online community formed, calling themselves the 47. They plotted topography, ran simulations, shared sightings, most of which led nowhere. But their commitment kept the case from fading completely into oblivion. Each year, a few more files were added. Another tip, another sighting, another false lead, each one ending in disappointment. But within that flood of failure, the deeper truth remained untouched. 4 people had vanished on a paved road in broad daylight, and 10 years later, the road was still waiting to give them back. The road had become part of the story. Route 47, the last stretch anyone knew the Carters had traveled. Over the years, it had been widened in parts, repaved in others, but most of it remained the same. Tight curves, uneven guardrails, stretches where the woods pressed too close. Truckers still drove it. Locals still avoided it after dark. But for most, the Carter case was just a strange chapter in the region's history. That changed on October 18, 2023, when a 3-person wildlife survey team, working under a state contract, was dispatched to map out dormant logging routes deep in the Colville National Forest. They were looking for signs of elk migration. What they found instead was a rusted metallic glint about 30 feet down from a jagged ridge just off a narrow and unmarked side road. At first glance, they thought it was logging debris. One of them, a forestry student named Andy Torres, crawled down for a closer look. Through layers of pine needles and moss-covered brush, he spotted the edge of what looked like a bumper, split, corroded, and coated in forest sediment. Then, the outline of a door panel. Then, a shattered window, caked in dirt and weathered glass. It was a vehicle, barely distinguishable from the earth it had been buried in. He called it in immediately. Deputies from Stevens County arrived hours later. The terrain was brutal. The SUV was resting at the base of a ravine so steep it was invisible from the road above. The drop wasn't massive, roughly 35 feet, but angled just enough to guarantee anything that went over would slide down silently and remain hidden from sight unless someone happened to stand in the exact right place. The team rappelled down cautiously, trying not to disturb the surrounding growth. The vehicle was heavily damaged but intact. The license plate, though rusted and bent, was still faintly legible. Washington plates. A match. The dispatcher reading it aloud paused, then radioed the words no one expected to hear. Possible Carter family vehicle. Repeat. Possible Carter vehicle located. By the next morning, the entire area had been sealed off. Crime scene tents were erected at the top of the ridge. Forensic teams worked slowly, methodically, documenting every angle before disturbing a single piece of the wreckage. Inside the SUV, they found 4 skeletonized remains, 2 adults, 2 children. The bones had settled into the seat structures, partially collapsed from time and pressure. Their clothing, while degraded, was identifiable. A child's sneaker remained lodged under the driver's seat. A tangle of hair was found near the third-row seatbelt buckle. Most of the windows had been shattered inward, likely from impact. There were no bags, no phones, no signs of forced entry. The news broke that afternoon. Missing Carter family vehicle found after 10 years. Dinah's sister Melissa was called by the sheriff personally. She didn't speak when he delivered the update, just hung up and drove 6 hours to the site, parking at the edge of the closure and sitting in her car for 2 straight days. Jeremy's brother, Nate, didn't come. He released a single sentence to the press. "They've been there all this time." Forensics confirmed what everyone already knew. Dental records and genetic comparisons with immediate family sealed the identities. It was the Carters. The remains were theirs. 10 years of searching had ended, not with a confession or a miraculous reappearance, but with a silent wreck buried in moss and pine needles just miles from where they were last seen. The investigation pivoted immediately to the ravine itself. How had no one found this earlier? The answer lay in the terrain. The shoulder of the road above had no skid marks, no barrier damage, and the slope was overgrown by seasonal brush so thick that visibility dropped to near zero from the road. No one walked that section. No one looked that far off the trail. Initial theories pointed to a missed turn or a lapse in attention. Jeremy may have been driving late in the day, distracted by the kids or low light, but the vehicle's position raised questions. It was upright. The parking brake was engaged. All 4 doors were closed. There was no sign of an explosive impact or fire. It hadn't flipped. It hadn't even crashed in the traditional sense. It looked placed, settled, as if it had stopped moving before it should have. Detectives brought in vehicle analysts to determine whether the SUV had coasted or been steered down the embankment. Preliminary findings showed no sign of brake failure. The gear shift was in park. Personal items, Dana's purse, a coloring book, Caleb's dinosaur figurine, were still inside. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been added. The mystery that had once been about where they went now transformed into something stranger. They were found. But how they ended up there, and what happened in those final moments, was a question the discovery didn't answer. And as investigators studied the wreck, a darker realization began to settle in. This was not a simple accident. Something was off. And if the SUV had been hidden for 10 years, maybe it wasn't just the forest that kept it secret. Maybe someone wanted it that way. At first, the discovery felt like a miracle, or at least an answer. After 10 years of theories and silence, the Carters had been found. Their SUV was recovered, their remains confirmed, and the headlines offered a sense of resolution. But within days, that relief began to erode. As forensic investigators worked through the vehicle and the bodies, a strange pattern emerged, one that didn't follow the expected trajectory of a fatal crash. In fact, the scene didn't resemble a crash at all. The SUV wasn't crumpled against a tree or wedged into a ditch. It sat nestled at the base of the ravine as though gently placed there. The front end had moderate damage consistent with sliding through underbrush, but there was no shattered windshield, no collapsed roof, no deployed airbags. The tires were intact. The ignition was off. Even stranger, the gear was in park. That single detail stopped investigators cold. For a vehicle to roll 35 feet down a slope and come to rest without flipping, without major impact, and still be in park was virtually impossible, unless someone had driven it down slowly, or it had been towed. But then why weren't there tracks? Inside, the SUV looked untouched. Personal belongings were scattered, but not violently so. Dana's purse sat upright in the passenger footwell, unzipped. Maddie's blue notebook was found wedged between the second-row seats, the last page scribbled with shapes, and a faint drawing of what looked like a sun. Caleb's plastic dinosaur lay on the floor behind the driver's seat. A crumpled granola bar wrapper rested in a cup holder. There were no signs of struggle, no smashed windows from the inside. All 4 doors were shut, no blood, no visible injuries on the remains. Autopsy reports added more confusion than clarity. Forensic examiners determined that the family likely died within 36 to 48 hours of their disappearance. That placed their deaths around July 7th or 8th, 2013, just days after they were last seen at the gas station. But the cause of death wasn't trauma. It wasn't drowning, and it wasn't a crash. Toxicology screens showed signs of mild dehydration and the early markers of starvation. They hadn't been poisoned. There were no drugs, no alcohol, no trace of sedatives. What there was emptiness. Their stomachs were nearly empty. Their organs showed signs of metabolic shutdown due to exposure. They had been alive for some time after arriving wherever they ended up. And then, one by one, they faded. The body's positions inside the vehicle painted a chilling picture. Jeremy was found in the driver's seat, his bones slumped sideways toward the door. Donna was in the second row, partially reclined, her arm extended toward the front. Maddie and Caleb were in the back, curled toward each other. All 4 seatbelts were unbuckled. No one was wearing shoes. There were no broken bones, no signs of restraint. It was as if they had simply stopped. Forensic anthropologists couldn't determine the order of death with precision, but the absence of trauma suggested this wasn't a fast or violent end. It was a slow fade, dehydration, disorientation, exhaustion. But how could that happen in a car so close to the highway? Investigators returned to the terrain, trying to piece together the possibilities. Was it a navigational mistake? Did they get lost, panic, and drive down the slope thinking it led somewhere? But that didn't explain the gear and park, or the intact condition of the SUV, and it definitely didn't explain why they stayed there, why they didn't walk back up to the road, just 35 feet above them. That incline wasn't impassable. People had climbed it with gear. Why wouldn't Jeremy, a former Army mechanic used to rugged conditions, lead them out? Detective Karen Fields, who had quietly stayed with the case for a decade, studied the scene for hours. She took notes on every detail, brush patterns, rust lines, dust on the dashboard. She found herself haunted by a simple question. What made them stay in the car? The only partial answer came from the environment itself. The way the SUV was tucked beneath an overhang of rock and trees, it would have been nearly invisible from above. The light would have dimmed fast. The temperature at night could drop drastically, even in July. If the family had panicked, believed no one would find them, and lacked a sense of direction in the dense forest, they may have waited for help that never came. But even that explanation felt hollow. There were no footprints. No trail indicating anyone ever stepped outside the vehicle for long. It was as if they had given up before trying. Public response to the findings was fractured. Some people blamed Jeremy, arguing he must have made a catastrophic decision or fallen into some kind of psychological break. Others believed the family was manipulated, lured into that location under false pretenses. A few still clung to abduction theories, suggesting the family had been led off-road, then abandoned without the means to escape. But with no evidence of another party, those theories remained speculation. All that remained were the facts. The Carter family died together, not from violence or accident, but from silence. They were found whole, yet hollowed out by time and neglect. A family lost not in distance, but in direction. And the more investigators studied the scene, the more they realized. The discovery brought answers, but not understanding. Something was missing, something that still lay just outside the edge of explanation. In the days following the discovery of the Carter SUV, the story re-entered public consciousness with new force. News outlets replayed the details on a loop. Family found after 10 years. Mystery of Route 47 finally broken. The ravine that hid 4 lives. Photos of the SUV's location, blurred images of the skeletal remains, and close-ups of weathered belongings were shared across social media. People who had forgotten the case, or never heard of it, suddenly couldn't stop talking about it. Most comments were filled with sympathy or disbelief, but buried in that noise was a message that changed everything. Her name was Erin Bell. She was 31 now, living in Oregon, working as a dental assistant. But in July of 2013, she had been 16, on a road trip with her cousin and her cousin's boyfriend, heading home from a week-long camping trip in northern Washington. When she saw the coverage about the Carters on the evening news, the shot of the SUV's rusted frame, the reference to Route 47, the confirmation that the family died just days after they vanished. Something in her mind clicked. A moment she'd buried for 10 years surfaced, sharper now than it had ever been. She called the Stevens County Sheriff's Office the next morning. She wasn't sure anyone would take her seriously. After all, it had been a decade. But the duty officer who took the call didn't hesitate. Aaron explained that on July 7, 2013, 2 days after the Carters were last seen, she and her relatives had stopped at a roadside turnout off Route 47. They'd been arguing about directions. Her cousin thought they'd missed a turn, so they pulled over to check the map. It was late afternoon, warm, quiet, and that's when she saw them, another family about 20 yards down a dirt trail that branched off from the turnout. What caught her eye wasn't the car. It was the way the man standing with the family gestured, guiding them, almost ushering them forward. There was a woman holding a child's hand, a second child a few steps behind, and a man who looked unsure. The person leading them wasn't yelling or forcing, but his presence stood out. Aaron remembered how tall he was, unshaven, wearing a dark hoodie even though it was warm. He held something in his hand, a walking stick maybe. She only saw them for a few seconds before they disappeared behind a bend in the trees. She assumed it was a stalled vehicle or someone helping with directions. It hadn't felt urgent at the time, but now she wasn't so sure. Detectives asked if she would be willing to sit with a forensic artist. She agreed. The resulting composite was eerily familiar. Short beard, deep-set eyes, slender build. Something about the sketch stirred a memory in Detective Karen Fields, who had taken the lead again since the SUV was found. She pulled an old case file from 2013, a list of persons of interest the department had quietly assembled in the months after the Carter disappearance. Near the bottom was a name, Alan Riker. Riker had been interviewed briefly in September 2013 after an anonymous tip placed him near the Route 47 corridor in the weeks following the Carter case. He was a known drifter with a history of vagrancy and trespassing, often traveling between Washington and northern Idaho. At the time, he was living in a small trailer tucked into a clearing miles off the main road. A deputy spoke with him once, no warrant, no search. He claimed to know nothing, and there was no evidence to contradict him. He didn't own a vehicle. He wasn't listed as a sex offender or violent felon. With no concrete link to the Carters, the lead had fizzled. But when Aaron's sketch was compared to Riker's driver's license photo, the resemblance was undeniable. She confirmed it without hesitation. "That's the man I saw," she told them. Riker had since died, found in his trailer 3 years earlier from what appeared to be a self-inflicted overdose. His death hadn't raised suspicion at the time. There was no suicide note, just a man who had lived alone, vanished from society, and died the same way. Now, he was back at the center of a story no one had solved. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Riker's property, even though it had long been abandoned. The trailer was partially collapsed, overtaken by vines and moisture. But inside, buried beneath old bedding and rusted tools, they found a locked footlocker. It was pried open with care. Inside, notebooks, dozens of them, some water-damaged, others remarkably intact. They weren't dated, but each one was filled with observations, drawings, survival notes, strange musings about the woods, the road, the people he claimed to have encountered. One entry stood out immediately. In shaky handwriting, the passage read, "Saw a family Sunday, lost, confused, 2 kids, they followed easy, no noise, just took the trail." The page was marked with a small star in the corner, the only one like it in the entire collection. That single passage didn't confirm guilt, but it offered something the case hadn't had in 10 years, a name, a direction, and a chilling glimpse into the hours after the Carters disappeared. Aaron's memory had opened a door no one knew existed, and through that door, something long buried had begun to crawl back into the light. The name hadn't surfaced in years. Alan Riker. In the early days of the Carter investigation, he was one of dozens of background checks, just another figure on a long list of regional loners, drifters, and ex-cons. He'd lived off-grid most of his adult life, hopping cabins and squatting along old forestry roads near the Idaho-Washington border. A survivalist, self-taught mechanic, quiet, but territorial. In September of 2013, barely 2 months after the Carters vanished, deputies visited his camp after a hiker reported hearing screams echoing from the woods near mile marker 65. When they arrived, Riker was calm, cooperative, and alone. He said he'd heard coyotes. They searched the area, found nothing, no warrant, no cause, no connection, and he was left alone. Now, with Aaron Bell's eyewitness account matching his description, and with his name scribbled in an old interview log, detectives had reason to look again. Only this time, Riker wasn't there. He had died in 2019. His official cause of death was self-inflicted overdose, fentanyl-laced pills ingested in a collapsed trailer deep in the foothills north of Colville. The property had been untouched since then, half swallowed by vines and forest decay, declared condemned by the county. But with a search warrant in hand, investigators returned to that hollowed-out space to see what time had left behind. It wasn't much. The inside of the trailer smelled of mildew and old animal waste. Furniture lay in splinters. Rodents had chewed through wiring. Rainwater pooled in one corner, staining the floor with rust and fungus. But amid the ruin were signs of the man Riker had been. A shelf lined with handmade tools, cans of preserved food long expired, and beneath a warped plywood board near the back wall, a locked ammunition case. It took 2 crowbars to open it. Inside were journals, 27 of them, some damp and partially ruined, others dry and intact, all handwritten in tight, jittery script. Each covered a span of weeks, some labeled by month, others by no label at all. The journal dated July 2013 was the focus. Investigators flipped through erratic pages, rants about satellite poisoning, entries about animal tracks, drawings of forest paths. Then came a page near the center. July 9th, 2013, 2 days after the Carters were last seen. The entry read, "Family came through, 4, 2 small ones, SUV packed good. They followed easy, too easy, stayed on the edge, quiet, kept the mother nervous, father suspicious, kids didn't talk. Took them off the trail, gave them the ravine, left them there. The room went silent. That one passage rewrote the timeline. It wasn't a roadside accident. It wasn't a navigational mistake. Riker had encountered the Carters, guided them, misdirected them, and then left them somewhere they couldn't climb out from. There was no mention of violence, no confession of harm, but the implication was heavy. He had lured them away, left them to die, and there was more. In a second lockbox hidden beneath the same floor panel, detectives found a stack of water-damaged photographs, most curled and faded. Some were of nature, trees, streams, animal traps. But 6 photos were different, captured on an old disposable camera, grainy, unfocused, but unmistakable. The first showed a silver SUV parked awkwardly in a wooded clearing. The next, Dana Carter standing beside the passenger door, shielding her eyes. Another, Jeremy half-turned, looking off into the trees. One showed Maddie and Caleb, their backs to the camera near a log. The final image was the most haunting, an overhead angle from a ridge above the SUV, the family sitting on the ground near the vehicle, bags around them, heads lowered. They looked tired, isolated, waiting. Detectives stared at the photos for hours. Each timestamp placed the images between July 7th and July 9th, confirming they had survived for days after their disappearance. They hadn't crashed or gotten lost by accident. Riker had been with them, or near them, and at some point, he walked away, leaving them in a place where no one else would ever look. But the question lingered. Why? What did he want? Riker's journals hinted at a paranoid, detached worldview. He believed people brought contamination, noise, toxins, mind rot, as he called it. He referenced avoiding road watchers, described society as a trap, and often spoke of the forest as a kind of salvation. One line stood out: "They always want to be saved, but no one asks if they should be." It was clear he saw himself as more than just a recluse. In his fractured logic, he was a gatekeeper. And the Carters had wandered too close to his domain. Despite the revelations, no charges could ever be filed. Riker was dead. His confession was cryptic. But combined with Aaron's eyewitness report, the photographs, and the timeline, investigators were certain they had found the missing link. The man who led the Carters off the road, the reason no one could find them, and the reason, once found, it still didn't make sense. The news rattled the region again. For Dinah's sister, it was unbearable. "He watched them suffer," she said in a written statement. "He walked away and let them die like animals." Jeremy's brother refused to speak. No one knew what justice looked like when the person responsible was already buried. And yet, even as investigators packed up the journals, even as they closed the case with a final report, one detail sat at the center, impossible to shake. The family was alive for days. They could have been saved. But no one knew where to look. Because Alan Riker had made sure of it. It took weeks to piece together the truth. With Riker gone, investigators were left with fragments, his journals, old GPS pings from a salvaged burner phone found near the trailer, and the haunting photographs of the Carters in the woods. But slowly, painstakingly, a timeline began to take shape. It started with the surveillance footage from the gas station on July 5, 2013. That part was never in question. The Carters left Ponderay around 2:15 p.m. and were last seen on camera at 4:43 p.m., fueling up off Route 47. They were calm, normal. They had no idea they were about to cross paths with a man whose entire life revolved around vanishing. Riker had been in the area that week, living out of a tent near a decommissioned ranger station roughly 7 miles off the highway. The GPS coordinates logged on his burner phone, retrieved from an old cell phone tower record, placed him near the same turnout Aaron Bell described. Investigators now believe that sometime between 5 and 5:30 p.m., the Carters stopped, either due to car trouble or after being flagged down. Whether Riker manufactured a breakdown or simply convinced them something was wrong with their vehicle remains unknown. But the journals filled in the gaps. In one entry, Riker described how the father hesitated and how the woman kept looking back at the road. He wrote, "They were uncertain, but they followed. Always follow when you give them hope." Riker claimed he offered to guide them to a ranger station deeper in the woods where they could get a signal or find help. He led them down an old, overgrown logging trail, barely passable, no signage, no turnouts. It dead-ended near an old fire line he'd cleared months earlier. There, in a crude makeshift shelter of tarps and old plywood, he convinced them to stay the night. He wrote of sharing water, telling stories, making the children laugh. He spoke of their exhaustion. Of the father asking too many questions. He never mentioned a weapon, never referenced force. His tools weren't physical, they were psychological. He made them feel stranded, dependent, isolated. In a passage dated July 7th, he wrote, "They wanted to walk back. I told them the roads were flooded. No point. Better to stay put. The mother believed me. He didn't." Investigators believe that by then, Riker had already tampered with their SUV, likely something subtle, like removing a fuse or disabling the ignition wire. There were no signs of major damage, no blunt sabotage, just enough to keep the vehicle quiet, immobile. He described himself as the edge of the map, and the family as caught between choices. And then, abruptly, his tone shifted. The July 8th entry was short. Too much talking, too many questions. Time to move. No explanation, no remorse. Just the sense that whatever control Riker thought he had was slipping. And so he left them. No map, no food, no clear trail. The Carters, realizing they'd been misled, packed what they could and attempted to find their way back to the road. They didn't know they were heading the wrong direction. Instead of climbing east toward the highway, they moved deeper into the woods, turning south along a shallow gully Riker had used as a game trail. That path eventually led to the edge of the ravine. At some point on July 9th, exhausted and likely dehydrated, they reached the drop. Investigators found scattered footprints near the incline, broken branches, slide marks. Dinah's shoe lodged between two rocks. They believe Jeremy tried to scout ahead first, possibly climbed down and called back. Whether he slipped or simply found it safer at the base is unclear. Eventually, all four made it down. The SUV was later found upright, doors closed, belongings inside. And then, nothing. No movement, no return. Inside the SUV, forensic soil samples confirmed the family had been at that location for at least 36 hours before dying. No campfire, no shelter. It appeared they stayed inside the vehicle, waiting, hoping, maybe believing that Riker would come back or that someone would find them. But no one knew where they were, and Riker made sure of that. Autopsy analysis confirmed the children succumbed first, likely dehydration compounded by heat and fear. Donna shortly after. Jeremy was last. His position in the driver's seat, leaned back, indicated he may have placed the others where he could see them. The tragedy wasn't just how they died, it was how close they were to being saved. The incline from the ravine to the road was steep, but not insurmountable. If they'd known which direction to climb, or had strength left to walk just a quarter-mile west, they would have stumbled onto a ranger outpost. But they were disoriented, trapped not by walls, but by confusion, hunger, and time. Detectives could only speculate on the moment they realized they wouldn't make it out. The journals never described it. Riker never confessed to watching them die. But the evidence left little doubt. He had orchestrated the conditions, sabotaged their vehicle, isolated them, lied to them, and when they were no longer easy to control, he walked away. The final image police returned to over and over was one of the photographs, Donna standing beside the SUV, her hand shielding her eyes, squinting toward something, someone, just out of frame. The look on her face wasn't fear. It was uncertainty, trust hanging by a thread, and behind her, the forest, wide and silent, already closing in. They found it wedged beneath the driver's seat, sealed in a zippered nylon pouch shaped like a cartoon robot. A handheld video recorder, kid-sized, plastic casing chipped but intact, the kind sold in toy aisles next to plastic walkie-talkies and digital watches. At first, the evidence tech assumed it was broken. It had been exposed to the elements for a decade, subjected to heat, moisture, insects, and collapse. But when the pouch was opened and the memory card gently extracted, something flickered on screen. Time-stamped files, video logs, dozens of them, some corrupted, unreadable, others shockingly clear. The first playable clip ran for 16 seconds, a shaky view of trees, leaves shifting in the wind, the camera panning awkwardly left and right before centering on a man's back. He was walking ahead of the family, tall, thin, wearing a hoodie, holding what looked like a walking stick. His face never turned to the lens, but his posture, his clothing, the environment, all matched descriptions of Alan Riker. His voice was faint but audible. "It's just a bit further," he said. "Almost there." A woman's voice, Dana's, responded nervously, "How much farther?" No reply. The next clip was longer, over a minute. The camera jostled wildly as it filmed from someone's lap. It showed Caleb sitting in the back seat, staring out the window. Beside him, Maddie held the recorder. Her voice whispered, "We're still here. We didn't go anywhere. He said we should stay." In the background, the forest loomed, blurred through the glass. Dana and Jeremy could be heard talking outside the car, their voices tense. "He's not coming back," Jeremy said. "It's been over an hour." Dana answered quietly, "We should have never followed him." Each video clip built a timeline, not just of movement, but of emotion. The optimism in the early clips, a sense they were being helped, shifted into fear, then quiet resignation. In one, Dana tried to smile at the camera, her face drawn with exhaustion. "We're just waiting," she said. "We're okay." Maddie asked when they could go home. Dana didn't answer. The last complete recording was only 38 seconds long. It was filmed from the rear seat of the SUV, handheld, angled slightly upward. Light filtered through the trees as the sun dipped behind the canopy. Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom's sleeping," he said. "Dad's outside. I think Maddie's sleeping too." The camera held steady for a few seconds before tilting to the passenger window. Trees, leaves, a patch of dark sky. Then, his voice again, "We're waiting for help." And that was it. For the investigative team, the footage changed everything. Not in terms of solving the case that had already been pieced together from journals, photos, and forensic evidence, but in tone. Until that moment, the Carters had been a mystery, their suffering reconstructed in clinical terms. The footage made it real, made it human. The emotion in Dana's voice, the tremble in Maddie's hands, the way Jeremy paced in the background, checking the tree line again and again. They weren't just lost, they were abandoned, stranded by someone who knew the terrain, knew how to vanish, and knew they couldn't. The memory card was carefully cloned and stored. The original was sealed in evidence, but a copy was played, privately, for the family members who had spent 10 years clinging to fragments. Melissa, Dana's sister, watched it without blinking. At the end, she said nothing, just stood, walked out of the room, and collapsed in the hallway. Jeremy's brother Nate, long withdrawn from media and public attention, asked only to hear Caleb's final clip twice. He didn't ask to see the others. The sheriff's office released a statement the following week. It confirmed the case was officially closed. The Carter family had been located. The circumstances surrounding their disappearance had been determined with reasonable certainty. No additional suspects were being sought. There would be no charges filed. Riker was dead. Justice, in the traditional sense, would never come. But the truth had surfaced. That had to be enough. Still, for those closest to the case, closure remained elusive. The question shifted from who or how to why. Why had Riker chosen them? Why lead them down that trail? Why walk away knowing they'd never find their way back? The journals offered no clear motive, no vendetta, no ideology. Just fragments of a disordered mind, paranoia, control, isolation. Perhaps the Carters were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps that's all it ever was. The final image in the recovered footage is still seared into the minds of those who watched it. Not the man's back, not Dana's forced smile, not even Caleb's whisper, but a 6-second stretch of stillness near the end, where the camera lingers on the trees. No wind, no sound, just forest. Endless, unblinking. It's the kind of silence you don't notice until it's too loud to ignore. The kind that swallows footsteps, cries for help, and voices promising return. In the end, the Carters weren't killed by violence or malice in the traditional sense. They were killed by delay, by misdirection, by being forgotten in a place where the road ends and the wilderness begins. Their story lives now in case files, recovered footage, and the questions left behind. But for those who watched them walk into the trees, who saw the forest refuse to let them go, the truth lingers, in the soundless space between the last frame and what was never filmed.